David Harris with the American Jewish Committee. And I want first of all to tell our speakers, I've been to literally hundreds of Holocaust commemorations. Rarely have I been as touched and moved by each of the speakers as was the case tonight from beginning to end. I want to thank you, and especially you, Julian, for touching us in a very profound, very deep way, and for overcoming your fear of exhibitionism, as you called it. Thank you. I want to tell you that I'm standing here because of a boy who was 16 years old in 1936 in Vienna, who was a bit of a wunderkind and who began studying the synthesis of the heavy hydrogen atom at the chemistry and physics faculty at the University of Vienna, until 2 years later in 1938, after the Anschluss, he as a Jew was no longer deemed fit to study the synthesis of the heavy hydrogen atom. He was deemed fit to shine the boots of Nazi officers walking the streets of Kirchenstrasse. That young man was my father. I'm standing here because a 16-year-old girl, a refugee from Stalin's Russia, with her family had found haven in France until 1940, when the Maginot Line proved rather invincible, and suddenly she and her brother and her parents spent 17 months fleeing and hiding, and knocking on one door after another of governments far from Europe, begging for a visa, anywhere, at any price. And that young girl was my mother. They would be horrified. Horrified. Not that their stories are being told, because that's our obligation. They would be horrified because my mother heard before her death, again, words that she never thought she would hear when she finally left France at the end of 1941 and entered Spain. Mort aux Juifs. And I, as her son, had to explain to my Holocaust surviving mother how it could be that decades after the Shoah, decades after hundreds and thousands of political leaders had repeated never again, on January 27th and other commemorative days, how could it be that the demons had returned? These were not easy conversations for me to have with my mother. And she said shortly before her death 15 months ago, in a way she said, "I'm glad I'm dying. But who was going to protect my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren? Who was going to protect them," she said. She believed that liberal democracy would protect them. She believed that the European project, built on the ashes of the Shoah, would protect them. She believed that the United Nations, also built on the ashes of the Second World War and the Shoah, would protect them. But she died in doubt. In a way, she was murdered a second time. What we began to see 2 decades ago here in Europe was something that alarmed us, but we went to our friends, the political leadership in country after country, especially of Western Europe, and we said that we, as friends of Europe, are here to tell you that the demons are back. Wake up. But most most refused to listen to the wake-up call. They wanted to live, if you allow me, in their fantasy world of the Europe that had been created by Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet and Paul-Henri Spaak and Konrad Adenauer, in which had done such remarkable things to build a new Europe. And the last thing they wanted to hear was Jews coming back and saying, the project is imperfect. It took years and years, longer than it should have, for the wake-up call to be answered. And then when it became answered, we had a second challenge. Most political leaders wanted to weaponize the issue. So they were perfectly willing to confront anti-Semitism when it came from the far right, when it came from neo-Nazis, Carpentras, or more recently, Halle. But when it didn't come from the far right, that presented a conceptual political challenge. And in reality, every fatality of a Jew as a Jew in Europe, other than Halle, has come not from the far right in recent years. Toulouse, Paris and Paris and Paris, Brussels, Copenhagen, Burgas, Bulgaria, the attempt on the Oranienburg synagogue 5 days before Halle did not come from the neo-Nazis in the far right. But that was difficult, because after all, for many European political leaders, how could people who themselves were seen as potentially downtrodden, impoverished, maybe even victims of persecution, how could the victims be perpetrators at one and the same time? And so we had to overcome this weaponization or politicization. And then we had a third challenge. The third challenge was, tragically, there is no Jonas Salk who has yet created the vaccine against anti-Semitism. So this is not a one-time declaration or statement on January 27th or any other day of the year. This is about something more, a sustained, multi-pronged effort to outlast and outlive and defeat, ultimately, the haters. But most governments are not good at long-term projects. I understand that. It's difficult to sustain attention from one administration to another as political shifts occur in country after country. But there's no other way. Because we kept insisting, as the Vice President said, if we're only commemorating murdered Jews, we're doing no service to living Jews. We can commemorate all we need and must. Nothing we do will bring back the victims of Babi Yar and Belzhitz and Birkenau and Buchenwald. All we can do, if we're really sincere and serious, is protect living Jews. Stand in solidarity with living Jews. And not just for the sake of Jews, for the sake of humanity, for the sake of the European project, for the sake of liberal democracy, for the sake of pluralism, and even for the sake of the United Nations. And if we're not ready to commit ourselves to living Jews, who needs tears on January 27th? If January 28th is business back to usual. And I would go a step further, if I may, because the issue of Israel is central to this conversation. For any Jew, I believe, or certainly for this Jew, one cannot discuss the lessons of the Shoah without understanding the link for us to this flag and to its meaning. And unfortunately, too often, here in Brussels and beyond, that understanding is missing. It's missing. my parents, more than once, asked the plaintive question, what if this flag had flown in Brussels, or in their case in Paris and Vienna, in 1938, rather than 1948? How many Jews would have been saved when my mother and others watched the utter, cynical failure of the Evian Conference in 1938, allegedly organized to solve the Jewish refugee problem, or the subsequent Bermuda Conference of 1943, also allegedly meant to address the Jewish refugee problem? How many Jews like my mother would have found refuge? Here too often, Israel is a discussion about areas A, B, and C. I don't want to minimize political issues regarding Israel or any other country, but when there's a disconnection, almost a cognitive dissonance for so many about the relationship between the fear of anti-Semitism today and the centrality of Israel in the Jewish psyche. And instead the conversation is about areas A, B, and C, and delayed association council meetings. And this is how Israel becomes. Something is missing. And then we try to make the point, and we still do, that if you want to be serious about anti-Semitism, education is a convenient word to invoke, but it's not so simple. It's not so simple to take children, including children who have no European background, and try and instill in them a sense of not responsibility, but awareness. Awareness of the slippery slope, not just as it relates to Jews, that began with words, dehumanizing words, and led from January 1933 and Hitler's ascent to January 1942 and the Wannsee Conference to implement the final solution, the Endlösung. 9 years it took, but also to instill in them something else that's not a Jewish concern alone. How could a civilized, educated, advanced country that was a democracy after the First World War, by 1933, lose its democratic moorings and unleash the greatest crime in history against not only the Jewish people, but civilization? If our children cannot understand in schools, not just what befell the Jews, but the thin veneer of liberal democracy and how it can unravel, then what's the future? So the difference for me between then and now is, first of all, that unlike then, there are no anti-Semitic leaders of European governments today who openly call for the separation of Jews or the persecution of Jews, although some will play when it's convenient with Jewish tropes. But that's a fundamental difference, and the fact that so many traveled last week to Jerusalem and this week to Auschwitz says a lot. But the other difference, the reason that gives me more confidence, Julian, is that Israel exists today. That was the missing ingredient then. That's what gives me confidence as a Jew, that my children and grandchildren will have a reference point that my parents didn't have. It's all too easy to end on a depressing, dispiriting note, but let me go out of character. Last Thursday, while President Macron and President Steinmeier and Prince Charles were in Jerusalem, AJC chose to be elsewhere. We were in Auschwitz last Thursday. And the reason was because we assembled a group of 62 senior Muslim leaders from the Muslim World League, headquartered in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. We assembled them in Auschwitz on the morning of last Thursday, January 23rd. There had never been anything like this. No such senior Islamic delegation had ever visited Auschwitz or any Nazi death camp. But they came. And I walked with them. And I watched as they absorbed the story that most of them had never heard before. Or if they heard, it was in such a distorted, skewed fashion that they had to overcome that first. The head, Sheikh Dr. Al-Alisa, stood in front of the exhibit of children's shoes at Auschwitz. And all of a sudden I felt that he held my hand. And when I looked out of the corner of my left eye, there were tears coming down. He was transfixed. Nothing he had ever heard in his life prepared him for seeing the shoes of children a year, 2, 3, 4 years old, and thousands of them. He understood that this was not some Hollywood set built by the Jews in order to try and persuade them of our tragedy. He saw the human hair. He saw the eyeglasses. He saw the suitcases. He saw the prosthetic limbs. He saw the pots and pans of people who had been told that they were simply being resettled, and so brought their housewares with them. And so did his colleagues. And then in Birkenau, the site of the killing of almost all the Jews of Auschwitz-Birkenau, no more than 50 feet perhaps from the site of where the gas chamber and crematoria had been, these Muslim leaders took out rugs and they prayed a memorial service on the grounds of Auschwitz after we, the Jews, had said our Kaddish and El Molei Rachamim, our memorial prayers. And there was not a Jew around that wasn't in tears. I don't want to pretend that this is the opening of an entirely new chapter, but it's the start of something. If we're serious about teaching the lessons, we have to reach out. We're fighting social media in too many cases. We're fighting skepticism and cynicism and entrenched anti-Semitism in too many places from too many sources. And the American Jewish Committee will continue as we can to bring more such Muslim leaders, more leaders generally. And I want to tell you that by Friday, Iran, Hezbollah, not that divided concoction that people here at the EU want to project of a political and military wings operating separately from one another. Hezbollah, the Houthis, Al Jazeera had publicly condemned these Muslims for going to the so-called death camp. That's what we're up against. It's not just from that quarter. It's from neo-Nazis and white supremacists and all those others who've been waiting for the survivors to begin to vanish like my parents, to give them more running room, hoping that the Hannah Roses, the young people, the Alina Brickmans, the young people, will not be able to compete with their messaging going forward. Alina and Hannah, you have to win, because you're not alone. There are others who are just waiting for the moment for the last survivor to vanish. So our job is to ensure that their job is possible. Thank you and good night.